At the personal decree of the emperor, he was officially permitted to commit 9 capital offenses punishable by death and remain absolutely unpunished. In the chronicles of the most ruthless empire the world has ever known, there existed only one such warrior, and his name was Jelme. But here lies the greatest paradox. Having received the legal right to commit absolute evil, he transformed into a symbol of ultimate sacrifice. While other chieftains fought for titles and spoils of war, this man fought for the very life of his Khan, literally sucking poisoned blood from his wounds and giving his leader the last mouthful of water in the barren desert. Today, you will discover why the son of a forest blacksmith ended up being closer to Genghis Khan than his own blood kin, how, during the Night of Blood, he infiltrated the enemy camp alone, armed with nothing but sheer audacity, and saved the future of a nation, and why enemies branded him and his brothers the 4 hounds, whose jaws would not unlock even after death. This is not a story of blind obedience. This is the chronicle of how a single individual who voluntarily chose the role of a shadow defined the destiny of a continent. In a world where fathers and brothers betrayed one another, this legendary Noker proved a fundamental truth. A state is not built on fear, but on loyalty that transcends the instinct for self-preservation. In our time, his fate serves as a rare example of the number 2 who ensured the triumph of the number 1. Without Jelme, Genghis Khan would simply not exist. But this legend begins long before the great battles. It all started not with blood, but with a gift. It began the moment a father handed his son over to serve an outcast, never suspecting that he was placing the key to half the world in his hands. 12th century Mongolia was a world divided by an invisible wall. On one side were the people of the felt walls, the steppe aristocrats, proud of their vast herds. On the other were the people of the forest, the Uryan-hai, who inhabited the northern lands. They did not herd sheep, they conquered iron. It was from this environment of fire and hammers that the man destined to become the Khan's shadow emerged. Fate did not prepare Jelme for high politics. His father, the old blacksmith Jar-Chudai, was accustomed to looking into the furnace of a kiln, not beyond the horizon. When the old man descended from the Burkhan Haldun mountains to the yurt of Yesuge Bahatur, the father of Temujin, he did not bring weapons or armor, he brought his own son. In that era, the steppe was mired in bloody chaos. Clans exterminated one another in the struggle for pastures, and Temujin's family was in an extremely vulnerable position. The future seemed shrouded in fog. Yet, precisely at this lonely yurt of an outcast, the old blacksmith performed a strange, almost mystical act. He handed over his firstborn, Jelme, into the service of another boy. Leaning over the cradle, the old man uttered prophetic words. "Let him put on your saddle. Let him open your door." In that instant, Jar-Chudai entrusted the most precious thing he possessed to a child who had been stripped of everything. To those around them, it seemed the old man had lost his mind. Handing over a free-born son into slavery to a persecuted outcast looked like madness or a disgrace to the entire clan. However, the blacksmith possessed an instinct for human metal. In the young Temujin, he recognized that steel which cannot be forged in an ordinary furnace. It is a twist of fate. A man who spent his life working metal for other people's horses, on that day tempered the destiny of the entire empire by gifting it its greatest protector. This decision tied their lives together in a knot that no sword could sever. Jelme became not merely a servant, but an Anda, a sworn brother in spirit. But loyalty in times of peace is cheap. The true price of this gift was revealed later, when death approached Temujin within striking distance. The children transformed into warriors. Temujin began his thorny path toward uniting the tribes, but the steppe rarely forgives ambition. In 1202, in the tracts of Koyten, his army clashed with the coalition of Jamuka. Arrows pierced the air, and the sky turned black with dust. The skirmish turned into a genuine massacre. In the midst of the battle, a stray arrow found its mark. Temujin, the future ruler of the world, collapsed from his horse. His breath was cut short. Poison was already coursing through his veins. Panic seized the army. Enemies were pressing the allies, and night was descending on the steppe, hiding the dying leader. Jelme remained alone with him in the middle of a frozen desert of death, without medicine, without water, and it was then that he decided on a desperate move that violated all laws of self-preservation, an act that became legend. Darkness blanketed the Koyten tracts, turning the battlefield into an icy labyrinth where every sound signified death. In the center of this chaos, in a hastily covered hollow, the life of the man who promised to unite the world was fading away. The poison from the wound in Temujin's neck was acting swiftly. His breathing became erratic, and his face turned gray, taking on the color of ash. Thousands of enemies prowled around, and any glint of fire would have betrayed their shelter. On this night, Jelme ceased to be just a servant. He transformed into the only barrier between the Khan and oblivion. Noticing that the wound was clogging with black cloths, Jelme pressed his mouth to his master's neck. He possessed no medical skills, he had no instruments. The only available tool was his own lips. Hour after hour, the warrior sucked out the poison and spat it out until a crimson puddle formed around them. At some point, afraid of betraying their position with the sound of spitting, he began to swallow this liquid. By midnight, Temujin regained consciousness. His first word was a hoarse groan. "Drink." Thirst was burning him from the inside out. The flasks were empty, and the path to the nearest stream was blocked by the cold. Life-giving moisture could be found in only one place, in the enemy camp. Jelme stood up. Knowing that any armor would create noise, he cast everything aside, boots, clothes, remaining almost naked on the frozen ground. Grabbing a bucket, the warrior stepped straight into the camp of the Keraites, right where hundreds of sentries guarded carts of provisions. In this act, one could read not just bravery, but sheer audacity. He took a desperate risk. He slipped through the ranks of the enemies like a ghost. No one stopped the half-naked man walking confidently between the tents. They mistook him for one of their own. Jelme discovered a vat of curdled milk, scooped up a full bucket, and returned just as silently. Mixing the sour milk with the remaining water at the bottom, he gave the Khan a drink. When dawn illuminated the steppe, Temujin noticed traces of bloody vomit and asked, "What is this?" Jelme answered simply, "I did not want to move away from you to spit, fearing the enemies would hear. Therefore, I swallowed your blood." There is a terrifying irony in these words. Temujin's enemies were celebrating victory, believing the wolf was bleeding out in a ravine, but in reality, one man was literally feeding the other with his own life force. Jelme performed a sacred exchange. He took the Khan's poison into himself and returned life to him through milk. That night, they became more than sworn brothers. They became a single organism. But even this feat served merely as a prelude. The true stab in the back followed in 1203. Temujin was betrayed by the one he revered as a father, the powerful Ong Khan, ruler of the Keraites. Enemies crushed Temujin's army. The remnants of his loyal warriors took shelter in the swamps near Lake Baljuna. Hunger tormented them, and they had to quench their thirst with muddy sludge from the dirt. It seemed this was the end. It was there that the event known to history as the Baljuna Covenant took place. Temujin looked over his handful of faithful followers, only 19 men, among whom stood Jelme, Subutai, Jebe, and Khubilai. He raised his hands to the sky and swore an oath, if they survived, he would share everything with them, both the bitterness of defeats and the sweetness of future triumphs. In the swamp mud, not in golden tents, the true empire was born. And to defend it, Temujin decided to create something fundamentally new. He did not require an army prone to betrayal. He required a pack. Many mistakenly believed that the famous Kheshig, Genghis Khan's personal guard, immediately emerged as a 10,000-strong armada. But the truth is far more dramatic. In that cursed year of 1203, immediately after Ong Khan's betrayal, the first composition of the guard numbered only 150 men, 70 day guards, 80 night guards, and that was it. This was a handful of people lost in an ocean of hostile tribes. But each of these 150 warriors was worth an entire tumen, 10,000 men. Jelme became the architect of this living wall. He understood, when the whole world is against you, numbers play no role. The only thing that mattered was who stood at the door of your yurt while you slept. The commander personally selected men not by the nobility of their lineage, but by their capacity to die in silence. Wars of 100,000-strong armies of Keraites and Naimans raged across the steppe, but the fate of these battles was decided by a tiny detachment that enemies called the Night Watch. Jelme introduced the strictest code. Anyone who enters the Khan's headquarters at night without permission must be killed, even if it were Jelme himself. "If I enter, split my head open," he told his men. It was then, by the muddy waters of Baljuna, that the quartet of commanders finally formed, whom enemies in terror nicknamed Dervan Nohoi, the Four Hounds or Dogs of War. Jelme, Jebe, Subutai, and Khubilai. The enemies laughed at their small numbers. Ong Khan, feasting in his court, considered Temujin a corpse. Here lies a great irony. The old Khan thought he had trapped the wolf by stripping him of his army, but in reality, he had done Temujin the greatest service. By sifting out the weak and the traitors, he left him only the pure concentrate of loyalty. The 150 men of the Kheshig became that diamond rod that would soon cut through the glass of the great Khanates. By 1206, this unit would grow to 1,000, and by the end of Genghis Khan's life, to 10,000. But the spirit of the Guard, its code of honor and fanatical devotion were forged precisely then, when the fighters numbered only 150 and they had nothing to their names but an oath and muddy water. Now that the Khan had protection that could not be bought, the time had come for the attack. The empire was growing, and its appetites demanded new lands. To the west rose the Naiman Khanate, the last and most powerful rival. Their leader, Tayang Khan, looked upon the Mongols with the contempt of old aristocracy. He had heard of the Four Hounds, but considered them merely savages from the swamps. But he made a fatal error by assessing the number of Mongols when completely failing to account for the quality of their fury. In 1204, at the foot of Mount Nahu, the two armies clashed. Tayang Khan, standing at the summit, looked down with confidence, believing that his heavy cavalry would crush the upstarts. Then he saw the Mongol ranks part, releasing 4 detachments to the front. They moved not like ordinary cavalry, but like a single predator. Tayang Khan asked his advisors, "Who are these people driving our wolves like sheep?" And the answer he heard made his blood run cold. Because on that day, the very men who had drunk the dirty water of Baljuna had come for his head. The Battle of Mount Naku became the point of no return when the legend of the hounds took on flesh. Jelme did not lead his men into a frontal assault, but sliced through the Naiman ranks with surgical precision. On that day, the commander did not simply sit on a hill. He transformed into the tip of the spear, aimed at the very heart of the enemy. Contemporaries described Jelme's style as inevitability. While others sought glory in individual duels, he methodically dismantled the enemy's command structure. Tayang Khan, watching the destruction of his army, realized a terrifying truth. His methods belonged to the past. The Naiman ruler relied on heavy armor and numbers, but Jelme countered them with mobility and absolute coordination. The great Khan fell not by the sword. His spirit was broken by the sight of his familiar world collapsing. There is a deep irony in this victory. Jelme, the former servant, crushed the elite of the steppe aristocracy. The man who had spent years repairing saddles and carrying water overthrew kings who considered themselves descendants of gods. The triumph marked the victory of a new philosophy. In Genghis Khan's empire, lineage lost all meaning in the face of absolute loyalty. After the defeat of the Naimans, Jelme ascended to the peak of his power. He had now transformed into a trusted confidant, deciding the fates of conquered peoples. But power did not intoxicate the old warrior. Within him, the iron heart still beat, for which the safety of the Khan was valued higher than the gold of captured cities. But every legend has a finale. The empire built by his hands was becoming too vast. It required different heroes and strategies. By 1206, the war in the steppe had ended, giving way to the struggle for peace. Genghis Khan turned his gaze south to the golden roofs of China and west into the unknown. At this moment, Jelme, the faithful hound who had passed through the hell of civil strife, began to slowly fade into the shadows. His mission was complete. He had preserved the life of the one who now owned the world. As often happens in history, the architect of the foundation becomes invisible when the walls of the palace soar into the sky. Jelme disappears from the pages of the chronicles as quietly as he once appeared at Yesoge's yurt. His departure marked the end of the era of pure warfare and left a vacuum that required managers of a new type. The empire no longer lacked blades. It needed economic order and complex administration, which would later be brought to life by the great Khubilai. Jelme traveled the path from the son of a forest blacksmith to a man whose shadow covered half of Eurasia. He achieved the impossible. He saved the life of the man who later redrew the map of the world, literally buying him back from death with his own blood. But here is the paradox. Possessing the legally granted right to commit any 9 crimes, he remained in the memory of descendants as the only one who did not commit a single sin against honor. We are presented with an uncomfortable truth. The greatest powers do not rest on fear or gold, but on the quiet, fanatical devotion of those who agreed to remain in supporting roles. The legacy of the Iron Heart permeates centuries, from the smoke of 12th century yurts to our present day. However, This is only the beginning of the construction of the great empire. If Jelme served as Genghis Khan's shield, Mongolia now required something more than just protection. It required arteries. But before we finish the history of the entire quartet, we must look at the one who directed the might of the horde into a different channel. Next stepped forth the fourth dog of war. He is often confused with the great-grandson emperor, but this general preferred seizing caravan trails to palaces. It was he who realized dominion over the world requires not only the extermination of enemies, but also control over their resources. The world remembers him as Khubilai the General. His path is the chronicle of transforming the sword into an instrument of diplomacy. The story of how a dog of war turned into the conqueror of paths, opening the Silk Road for the nomads. Subscribe so you do not miss the continuation of the cycle. Write in the comments, is loyalty worth remaining forever in the shadow of a great leader? And would you be able to give your life for a friend the way the hero of today's video did? See you in the next chapter.